Our top story, the war in Ukraine is taking a heavy toll, not just on Ukraine, but in fact all over the world. The disruption in supply chains, blockades of Ukrainian grain exports have worsened hunger in many parts of the world, especially the most vulnerable regions. Millions of civilians are unable to return home. Everyone wants to see a productive discussion now between Ukraine and Russia. Some hopes now of a possible relaxation of the aggressive war in the latest developments provide a sense of hope to millions. The Kremlin has said President Vladimir Putin is open to talks on a possible settlement to the conflict in Ukraine and believes in a diplomatic solution. The Kremlin's comments come a day after US President Joe Biden had suggested he was prepared to speak to the Russian leader. According to Biden, the only way to end the war in Ukraine is for Putin to pull his troops out, and that if Putin is looking to end the conflict, then Biden would be prepared to speak to him. Biden has also said the Russian president had miscalculated by invading Ukraine, and if that he's serious about getting out of Ukraine, then he would be willing to sit down with Putin after consultations with NATO allies.
Look, there's one way for this war to end, the rational way. Putin to pull out of Ukraine, number one. But it appears he's not going to do that. He's paying a very heavy price for failing to do it, but he's inflicting incredible carnage on the civilian population of Ukraine, bombing nurseries, hospitals, children's homes. It's sick what he's doing. But the fact of the matter is, I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is, let me choose my words very carefully. I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war.
Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called on Russian President Vladimir Putin to seek a diplomatic solution to end the war and also urged withdrawal of troops. Berlin says the two leaders spoke over the phone. The developments come as heavy fighting continues in the east of Ukraine. Earlier, Putin had said he had no regrets about launching what he called Russia's special military operation against Ukraine. Ukraine and the West say Putin has no justification for the war of occupation. Ukraine says it will fight until the last Russian soldier is ejected from its territory. For more on this story, we earlier spoke to our correspondent Susan Tehrani, who's in New York.
It was very interesting, and it came shortly and side by side, really, with the French President Emmanuel Macron, and shortly after that really long closed-door meeting between the two Western leaders. And you know, one can't help but wonder whether or not Macron really expressed concern about the problems that Europe is facing right now with the long winter haul and energy supplies due to this Russian invasion on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we did hear immediately afterwards the Russian president come out and say that he's willing to negotiate, not on the terms of the West, but if, for example, if Joe Biden and the West agree to recognize territories, quote unquote, seized by Russia. You know, a lot of experts and analysts said that ultimately, if there is going to be some kind of ceasefire or a breakthrough, then those parts of the Donbass region will have to be up for negotiation and discussion. The likelihood that Putin and his forces will pull back is very unlikely. So we'll have to wait and see, but it does seem like there is a glimmer of hope just because right now Europe is in an extremely tough situation regarding energy. On the one hand, as you rightly noted in your introduction, in the narration as well, that the energy crunch is real, food supply chain issues. And here in the United States, you know, it becomes a domestic issue. The Democrats are really feeling the heat as well. And then the money that's going into Ukraine, you know, from Capitol Hill, you know, that's coming up for discussion as well with the Republicans taking over at least the House. So I think it was calculated, it was measured, the comments that Joe Biden was making.
Significant developments, those to deconstruct the statements by Putin and Biden. We're now joined by Maximilian Haas, a Russia-Ukraine analyst. Thanks so much, Mr. Haas, for speaking to WION. Now, President Biden says if Putin is serious about ending the war, I'm willing to sit down with him and talk. The Kremlin says President Putin is open to talks on Ukraine and believes in a diplomatic solution, even as he insists that attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine will continue. The question really is there a glimmer of hope here? Is there an end to the war somewhere in sight, or would that be too optimistic of you?
Thank you for having me. Certainly there is no end to this war in sight. Vladimir Putin's position has not changed. That same rhetoric has been emanating from the Kremlin since the beginning of the war. And as his press spokesperson said today, Russia would only be willing to entertain these negotiations if the West and Ukraine recognize its territorial assertions. Now, remember, Russia claims to have annexed all of the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions. They don't control the entire territory of any of those regions. And of course, just earlier at the beginning of last month, on the 11th of November, they lost control of the city of Kherson itself, the only regional capital that they had taken. So the Russian forces are still very much on the back foot, although fighting is likely to not see as many large territorial gains now with the onset of winter, although both armies are fairly capable of fighting in those environments. But also the economic war between Russia and the international community is also ongoing.
All right. So you are certainly skeptical about these statements that have been made, especially those emanating from the Kremlin. Now, the trouble is that there is no change to the entrenched positions on the two sides. Kiev maintains that the only way the war can end is if the last Russian soldier leaves their land, whereas Putin is hell-bent on having the world, including the West, recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territory by Moscow. And therefore, the trouble is that, is this stalemate really going to continue, or is there any possibility that the two sides could show some sort of flexibility going forward?
Well, I think it really is beholden on the Russians to show flexibility. Of course, this is a war of aggression that they've committed countless human rights violations. They are seeking to unilaterally annex Ukrainian territory without the support of the local population. Despite these sham referenda they've held, we've seen the celebrations in Kherson upon its liberation and how Ukrainian soldiers were welcomed, whereas the local population, although there were some collaborators, many of them also took part in partisan warfare and information sharing with the Ukrainian army to help them retake that city. So the reality is that Putin is very much on the back foot. His armies are not advancing and in fact are still losing in some territory in Luhansk, and there's a concern that they may lose more in Zaporizhia as well. So the Ukrainians will be hoping that they can push the Russians back all the way back to the 24th of February lines, where they controlled only a small portion of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, as well as, of course, Crimea, which they annexed in 2014, also against international law. So the Ukrainians will be looking to get to that stage when they negotiate. The Kremlin is also very weak economically. They face a real sort of dire outlook with the oil price cap coming in as well, and the sanctions continue to bite and constrain their ability to spend money and grow their economy and trade abroad. So they still see the advantages on their side. Putin recognizes that this is an existential fight for him. Having launched this war, he knows it may be very difficult for him to remain in power if he surrenders. So I don't know if we'll see his calculations change until it gets to that real crisis moment for him.
All right. Well, at the moment, certainly there seems to be no room for flexibility going by at least Russia's actions so far. There is nothing the world would want to see more than an end to this war. But does that continue to be a pipe dream? That is the big question. Thank you so much, Maximilian Haas, for speaking to WION.
Thank you for having me.
President Biden is hosting French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte for an official state visit. There you see them out in front of the White House. First Lady there, Joe Biden there in his trademark aviator glasses, greeting the French president and his wife. This is the first state visit of the Biden presidency after the pandemic, and it goes to France. Emmanuel Macron, now the only French president to have two state visits with two different presidents. These two leaders, you can see, all smiles this morning. This afternoon, they spoke about the close relationship between France and the United States, as well as their commitment to defending Ukraine against Russian aggression. Here's what they had to say.
I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. If that's the case, in consultation with my French and my NATO friends, I'll be happy to sit down with Putin to see what he has in mind. He hasn't done that yet.
So for more, let's bring in ABC's Elizabeth Schulze, who was inside the room during that meeting. Elizabeth, first on what President Biden just said, that there is no talks in the offing between him and Vladimir Putin. Is there any daylight there, or is the United States essentially standing pat until Putin caves in?
You know, Terry, President Biden made it pretty clear. He said that until President Putin is showing signs that he really is willing to end this war, President Biden is not going to sit down and talk to him. He said he does not have plans to talk to Putin at this point. But he said if there is a willingness to take those steps to stop in this aggression, he would be all ears. Now, of course, we haven't seen that on the ground in Ukraine. That's not at all the message that President Putin has been sending. And this does put President Biden a little bit at odds with President Macron, who he's been standing side by side with all day here at the White House. We've heard President Macron say that he wants peace negotiations to move forward if possible. He wants to find a way for there to be a peaceful resolution in Ukraine. And right now, the President Biden said he's not seeing that path at the moment. He's open to that situation, but right now that contact hasn't happened.
And Elizabeth, if I can follow up, Macron has certainly been active in pushing or hoping for negotiations to begin. Do you feel that he wanted to get close to President Biden on this? Do you think there's any sense that behind the scenes Macron is carrying some kind of message? He says he's going to meet Putin in the next few days. Do you think he's carrying a message from the American president?
Well, there's no doubt that if President Macron is going to speak to Putin in a couple days, it would be hard to imagine, Terry, that the conversation with President Biden didn't come up as part of that in some way. And we heard President Macron was asked a similar question of what would it take to get to these peaceful negotiations. And he sounded to have a little bit more of a plan. You know, Terry, we've seen Macron try to act as sort of the de facto moderator here. He's been kind of the voice of the EU when it comes to these negotiations, and he's really tried to take the stand that there is a path forward. At the same time, you know, reiterating that one of the most critical pieces is for the aid to continue, that there is no near term. This doesn't look like it's going to be a conversation in the near term, even if he does speak to Putin in the near term. We heard both President Biden and President Macron talk about the need for additional aid, especially as we're heading into these winter months here.
And finally, Elizabeth, I want to draw on your business expertise, because French President Macron came to the United States with an agenda to back down the United States a little bit on one of Biden's signature accomplishments. That's the Inflation Reduction Act, which had billions of dollars of subsidies for American manufacturers of next generation energy. Essentially batteries and cells and such, and chips as well. And the Europeans say that these subsidies are really harming their industry. Do you think he made any progress on that? What I heard was President Biden essentially say, well, we can tweak that legislation a bit, but we are going to be our own supply chain. And yes, as I understood it, that was basically, we're going to keep subsidizing these next generation industries.
It's a little bit of a tough line there for President Biden to walk, because, Terry, we've been talking about it on the show, this push that the White House has been making to bring supply chains back, to invest in companies here in the U.S., to incentivize them and subsidize them to bring those production hubs here so that the supply chain isn't as reliant on international trade. And that means that other countries, including in the EU, could get hurt. And that's the complaint that we've heard from President Macron. It does sound like there was maybe a little bit of progress when it comes to the demands from Macron to amend some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. We heard President Biden admit this was a massive piece of legislation, hundreds of billions of dollars, and perhaps there's a way to make sure it can be carved out so that the trading allies are not hurt in the process.
All right, so maybe he gets a little something at the end of the day there. Elizabeth Schulze at the White House. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.